Okay, so we're going to start, next step, we're going to install the AEK aluminum trigger and trigger spring. So first we need to start by removing our takedown lever. And then next we need to punch out our, from left to right, punch out our pin for the front block. And see, if you have a punch block, it might make this easier. I don't. I'm just going to use a block of wood. I've been using it. Seems to do the job just fine. If you can support it, I've got some holes drilled in it to act as a punch block. Once you get your pin out, and what you need to do is remove the trigger pin, and that's going to have to go out from right to left because it's larger on the left side. And you just work your front block out. And again, like the rear block, it's going to be tight the very first time you take this apart. And I've never had this out on this particular gun, so if you take a punch and maybe work in there to kind of help get it started. It is going to be tight. There we go. Just work a punch in here a little bit and start to get this out. Still pretty tight. There we go. And you set that aside. Set our old trigger spring. You're going to take the whole trigger bar, your slide lock. Take your slide lock out. Now the next step, we're going to need to remove the trigger bar from the trigger. Just take a punch here and just work this pin out. I'm going to do this from right to left. And a little smaller punch. It doesn't have to. You don't have to move the pin all the way. In fact, I would recommend not doing that. Just enough to get the trigger bar out, and then if you ever want to reuse this trigger, you know, it's really easy. Just push the pin back the other way. You don't have as far to go. So your next step is going to be your aluminum trigger already has that pin in part of the way. So all you need to do is put your trigger bar in. And start punching this through, and this can be a little tricky to line your trigger bar up with that hole. And just tap a little bit to get started if you can. So what you have to do is get your trigger bar in here and line up as best you can. And this is really tricky. You almost need another set of hands, or just to hold your punch, hold this trigger bar in, and try to drive your pin through. It takes some force. And see, I already got it started a little bit, so now it's going to hold my should hold my trigger bar in place. Just finish driving it through. You want to drive this pin so that's flush on both sides. It's sticking out just a tad. Let's go just a little bit more. I'm just gonna go till it's just a little recessed on each, side. And there we go. I might actually drift this back just a tad. Now we're ready for reassembly into the pistol. What you need to do first is get your trigger spring hooked, and they got a nice little pin here that they send with this kit, so you can go ahead and get your spring lined up, and in that hole you might need to use a punch or something to help that spring lined up. And get that starter pin through. There you go. Now keep your pin in place while you install this until you get the trigger pin installed in the pistol. So what we need to do is go ahead and get our trigger bar. And actually, you can see a mistake I just made here, which is really good to see, is you need to do this with the trigger bar, or your trigger bar with your slide lock lever in place too, because this pin is too big. It sticks out on both sides of your trigger, so you really have to have all of it in place so you can go right on through your trigger spring and go ahead and line it up in here with your slide lock lever. And you'll need to kind of get this lined up and push this pin through. You see it's a little challenging here. Just not wanting to quite cooperate. There we go. Okay, now we're ready for assembly. Back in the pistol. Let's go ahead and drop our trigger back in. Go ahead and so what you might want to do is get your sear in first. Get your trigger pin in the sear first, and then aside. Otherwise, your trigger bar is up above your sear, and it's a little difficult to, little bit difficult. And let's kind of function. Let's go ahead and get our front block installed in place, and you be careful not to, on the left side here there's a little pin, a retention pin for holding your takedown lever. You should make sure that doesn't fall out during this process, either when you take it apart or when you're putting it back in the pistol. You're going to need that. And you can see there's your this little pin. This will come out. There's a little kind of an L-shaped retention pin. Just pop your block back in place, and I'm going to start with the front block pin. Let's get this work back in place. Do the last little bit here with get a bigger block, so I get this level. Last little bit with the punch. And then you just want to make sure it's, well, so I went a little too far. I want to make it sure it's flush on both sides here. Maybe just a little bit recessed on the one side, and there we go. Just make sure it's flush with where the frame comes down a little bit here for the takedown lever. I'll just make sure that's flush there, and just a tad recessed on this side. And next we're going to put the trigger bar in. And you should just be able to push this through with your finger. You might have to move the trigger around a little bit to line everything up as you push this through. You can see this pin on the other side. You're probably not going to be able to see it on the camera, but not quite lined up. So you might have to pull around on your trigger assembly a little bit. With this lined up, you might even punch on it a little bit with the hammer. Get started. Make sure it gets lined up. And you see our pin starting to come through. And of course, this has to go from left to right to your right side of your trigger pins. Get this flat end on it. I had a little tension there, didn't want to punch through. I just pulled on the trigger a little bit, kind of released some of that tension. There's a little tension in there with the pin wasn't all the way through. It was kind of sticking. Kind of seen her line things back up. Just punch this back in until it's flush. Okay, so now comes the big test. Let's test our trigger assembly here and our spring, and see if our sear engages. It does. Okay, we want to take our takedown lever, install that back in here. Work that back in. Okay, so we're going to put our slide back on, do a little function test. Make sure that trigger bar still gauges the sear and releases your striker. On this one, seems to be fine on my 40. I had to adjust the loop on the trigger bar where it engages the sear, and I had to bend it out just a little bit so it engage it, because it would not engage and not release when I pull the trigger. That seems to be perfect. Trigger's not near as gritty. It's a lot better. We still have to do the striker block and spring, so it still has a little bit of grit. Still a little bit. Once we do that, I think it'll really smooth it out a lot. So now that that's done, just go ahead and take this apart and drive our rear block pin back in place. Get a little better block here. A little sturdier block here. It's not giving as much. And you should want to drive that so it's a little, you want it a little recessed on each side. So drive it just a little bit more. Just a little more. And I'm just a tad. I try to get it to where it's recessed the same, or as close to the same on each side. It doesn't have to be perfect, but that looks pretty good.